the link so we can all tweet this thing out. All right, that's in our chat, Omar, and then Brian, this is in the chat with the Jito folks. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Everything SVM. Today, we've got Brian on the show, who is one of the earliest employees of Jito Labs and now currently the executive director at Jito Foundation. Just a recap of what this show is about. Our ethos is just build together. We believe open source software is the purest form of innovation, and we wanted to build a show that would serve as a means of communication and collaboration around different innovative things happening in the Solana virtual machine and on Solana in general. And I'm really excited to have Brian here today because I've been doing some research around restaking and NCNs, which are node consensus networks, and I wanted to understand more about that, and so decided to have him on and just have this conversation in the open and ask all my dumb questions and get all the smart answers back on how this works. And my co-host here is Omar. He's the CEO and founder of Mantis. You want to say hi, quick hi, Omar?
Hey guys, yeah. So we are Mantis. We're building a generalized intents framework as a network extension on Solana. We're powering intent execution across Solana, Ethereum, and cross-chain between Solana and Ethereum.
Cool. Brian, thanks for being on the show. Do you want to give maybe just a quick hi to everybody and a little bit about your background and kind of your backstory and how you got involved in Jito and got to where you are?
Yeah. Hey guys, excited to be here and chat about restaking and everything else going on with Jito. So I've been in Solana DeFi since early 2021. Kind of back then it was pretty quiet, but it's cool. Was bullish on Solana back then and just wanted to get really involved. And so kind of watched the DeFi landscape grow from scratch. And then was, contributing loosely to a few different protocols, but was also always kept my eye on Jito. Joined the team super early as we kind of thought about launching products on mainnet, and then have been with Jito for a little over 3 years and currently kind of leading the Jito Foundation as it kind of considers its next stage of growth and a lot of interesting products.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Jito. Met Lucas very early and Zano. I remember when Lucas was sitting at the Solana Labs office in San Francisco, and they were still wires hanging from the ceiling and stuff. We had just opened it, and I walked up to him, and I had never met him before, and I was like, "What are you working on?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm doing this thing called MEV," and I had no idea what MEV was at the time. But it's just really cool to have watched over the years, teams like Jito succeed in such a massive way. It's one of the most top grossing revenue generating protocols on Solana and in crypto generally, I think you could say. So congrats to you guys and the success that you've had. And, Jito started out as an alternative client on Solana to allow people to get transactions to land faster than other people and pay for that. But what is restaking and what are NCNs and how does that fit into the broader picture of the Jito ecosystem today?
Yeah, I mean, Jito, I think, is really more broadly kind of a value transfer and infrastructure layer for the Solana economy. Obviously, I think we're all really bullish on Solana, and I think we've kind of seen that play out with just how much activity is happening on Solana. And so there's overlap in all of these protocols in the sense that originally it was this kind of MEV-enabled validator client, and then there was a liquid staking token, Jito Sol, and its unique attributes were that it only delegated to validators that pass through this MEV benefit to their stakers. And so there was a benefit to people holding Jito Sol for the additional yield. And then that kind of created a virtuous cycle where validators would run the MEV client when MEV revenue was lower because they would get incremental stake. And so that helped it from kind of zero get off the ground because of that side benefit to validators. And then, those have done pretty well over the last 2 years. They're both kind of, the validator client has a little over 90% of stake weight. Jito Sol has about 14.3 million Sol. It's the largest LST in Solana by far. And so last year, or I guess kind of the start of this year, about a year ago, we were thinking, what else makes sense in this portfolio of protocols? And restaking really made the most sense of us, given one, the product need on Solana, and two, is the overlap there. And so, there's a core product need in the MEV business of Jito Solana for how tips are distributed, and that there was a pathway to much more decentralized distribution of this capital, which at the time was, a couple $1 million. Now it's, 15 or $20 million per epoch. So it's very important for the network to do that right. And so it was like, there's this core product need that we see in the Jito protocol. And then when we think about it, a lot of the basics of building this out are actually nothing specific to Jito. It's really like the generalized infrastructure for how to think about getting consensus on chain, how to think about distributing economics to other stakers on chain, things like node operation delegation. In some ways, it's like recreating some of the basics of the L1 infrastructure that Solana uses in a more protocolized environment. And so instead of doing our, the very discrete project that Jito wanted, it's let's build a generalized platform and then have that MEV product on top of that to serve this purpose, but really enable it to be a tool for all teams on Solana to build faster and better products for their users.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Can you give me an example of a node consensus network that would be built on top of Jitter restaking? Because that is kind of similar to like how MEV is built on top of the the protocol that like helps people like distribute the revenue. How does that work? What are like, and just like walk us through a story of like an actual team building one of these. I know there's a couple, so maybe you could pick one that you're open to talking about as a way of
example. And so for any listeners that like you may have heard of AVS, that's what like EigenLayer calls these. It's actively validated service. We thought that term is like actually not the most intuitive, and so it's really node consensus network is just like a generalized framework for how you could get different people to have consensus on anything. And so I think outside of the Jito MEV example, I think the other really cool example of a node consensus network is what Squads is doing. I think hopefully most people are familiar with Squads. It's a really popular multi-sig product, or at least originally a multi-sig on Solana. And their vision is to be more of like kind of a general banking layer for Solana. And so they wanted a more flexible MPC style environment, which is like, it has spending rules about like what signers can send to what addresses, limits on how much can be sent, and like insurance and all of this. It's comparable to maybe a Fireblocks or even like a Coinbase Prime for people that are familiar with that, where there's an additional level of customization that makes it much easier to use this purely on-chain product. The dilemma that they were in is that there was no way to enforce that kind of rule set in a decentralized environment previously, that it would have to be like Squads is the one overseeing the implementation of all these rules. If something happened, then like people are going to sue Squads or something like that. And so what they realized with restaking when we started to talk to them about it is that you could have, substantial amounts of economic security of, i.e. people, insuring these amounts with USDC or Sol or Jito Sol on chain. And then if something happens, then you get insurance there. And then you have a series of operators that have stake there that are enforcing the rules to make sure that people's capital is actually protected. And like there's even this kind of like parallel of like FDIC insurance or something, where again, if like a snafu happens. And so I think that's kind of one of my favorite examples of like the currently announced node consensus networks, because it's a primitive that is already an extremely popular product. And this is a way to actually enable like a better UX in a more generalized product for users that isn't possible without the restaking platform that Jito is hoping to build on Solana.
Can you help me understand the economics a little bit better? Like so let's say I'm providing insurance in USDC. What's an example of like something going awry, and maybe use Squads as the example, and like what happens to the insurance money, who gets it? How does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, that is highly specific to each individual network. I think Squads hasn't gotten through and publicly announced exactly how their economics are. But I mean, from like my like third party perspective that like isn't in the weeds with them discussing this, but like you can imagine people already pay for Squads. Like if you have a Squads multi-sig, you're paying like $50 a month or something because it's important to your business. If you had a much more flexible primitive, right? I mean, people are paying thousands of dollars per month for like Fireblocks or Coinbase custody. And so, they have a willingness from consumers to pay in USDC. And then if there are programmatic rules that need to be followed, then you can be passing through some portion of that payment to people that are securing the network, with the understanding that they need to stake to operators that enforce the rules in a good way. And if there is an issue, then they might get slashed for a portion of that capital to try and make users, if not whole, at least a refund on what they're getting.
Right. And so it's up to the team to make these design decisions about what kind of capital, like if it's USDC, Sol, Jito Sol, and then like what the slashing parameters are, like what causes a slashing event to happen. But that's already, those sort of knobs are just built into the protocol. So like when I set up my network, my NCN, I can kind of configure Jito restaking to support the use case that I'm going after, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, so it's intentionally designed to be as flexible of a primitive as possible. And that is because we're in maybe the first inning of restaking adoption, right? I mean, Eigenlayer has been around for a while, but like they still, haven't launched all the features they intend to. And so we felt like it was a mistake to be prescriptive about exactly how slashing should look, and how, like, is slashing required, and all of these policies that you could have. And so we, especially because the design space on Solana is very different from what it is on Ethereum. And so it is like a blank slate where everything can be customizable. So like you could have a node consensus network with only like one or two operators if you kind of like a permission, like social consensus whitelist. I think we don't even think that you need slashing. So the Jito tip router is like the MEV distribution that was announced a couple of weeks ago. Slashing is a stick, yield or rewards is a carrot. And so in some environments, given the scale of economic attacks, then you do need the stick. But in some, the carrot is probably sufficient. And it's certainly easier to start with slashing. And again, this is all designed where like a node consensus network can update its rules to implement slashing down the line. And then everyone else needs to opt into that. So there's no for economic attacks and how you arbitrate all of this. And so, yeah, it's extremely flexible. Each team, once you introduce slashing, there's a lot of kind of tail risks that you need to be thoughtful around. And so, for teams that require that, like we want to talk to them, have them consult experts, really be thoughtful about how they do it, but it's also not necessarily something they need to do. And it's very, very use by use specific.
Makes sense. Omar, what's your take here?
Yeah, no, I mean, so we actually, we also built Picasso, which, if you remember, implemented Solana restaking a very long time ago. So yeah, we share a lot of the same ideologies around restaking. We think it's super useful for making decentralized systems more verifiable. I guess one of the things, like, how quickly do you guys intend to roll out slashing in general? I don't know if that's something you guys can talk about, but at least for Eigenlayer, it seems like slashing is on the back burner for quite some time. I don't know. How do you guys think about like rolling out slashing on the roadmap?
Yeah, I think slashing is likely to be a couple months after the initial launch of Jito restaking. And there's this simple implementation that you can do pretty easily, but there's some pretty complicated edge cases that are maybe unavoidable. But like if you have a malicious node operator and a malicious node consensus network, then like I guess two sides of the three-sided marketplace could potentially collude and steal a significant amount of capital. And you can argue like the free market case that if you're staking to something, you should be smarter and you should avoid that. But trying to think if there are some guardrails in the implementation that you can do to prevent this. And then otherwise, I think there's, I forget even the wording they use, but it's like, the token where they're like arbitrating certain slashing incidents. And I think getting governance of any token involved as like a general arbitration layer for slashing introduces a lot of complexity and uncertainty for someone like a node consensus network that doesn't really want to absorb the governance risk of the token they're integrating with. And so that's another thing that we are uncertain about whether that should be included. So yeah, it's mostly just like these edge cases, but we also haven't seen from node consensus networks, that this is like their biggest gating issue in terms of integration. And so, it's something that we certainly want to get done, but it's not the most urgent thing.
That makes sense. I mean, I think your general philosophy of like let the devs cook and give them flexibility is super important, because they're going to have their own design decisions and like different economic ideas about how their economy is supposed to operate. And so if you're too prescriptive, then you're going to force them into a sort of a box, and you don't want to do that. So I like that. It sounds like even when you do launch, the ability to slash, it's totally optional. Like you don't have to use that as part of your NCN.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's, if your protocol requires slashing, then, maybe you have to pay a higher yield because the risk adjusted rate should be higher. It's, again, I think we will see standards evolve for various implementations of how to do this, but it's just too early for anyone to be predicting what this will look like in the future. And so for now, you can implement it exactly how you want it, but what is the value add of us trying to say how anything should be implemented?
Yep. So what are some examples, other examples of NCNs, like just concrete examples like that you guys have? Maybe they don't exist yet, but you're like, this is possible. This kind of node consensus network is possible. And then, by the way, I really liked what you said about like the difference between AVS and NCN. Like they're trying to agree on something. There's some data that they're trying to prove is correct, or some action that like some like workload these computers are doing that like we want to all agree is the output is the right thing. So that's the end result of an NCN. But like, what are some different use cases that you see that you'd be excited to have people build on top of Jito?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I guess, extremely high level. I think the entire like AVS terminology, just to like double click on that before we move on, and like the mindset of Solana developers is that everyone kind of sandbox restaking around like layer 2 modular scaling roadmap. That's how Eigenlayer pitched it all along, which is like logical in the context of Ethereum and what they're doing. But it's a much actually more flexible primitive. And so it's something that I've been thinking a lot about is how we kind of explain that and communicate that this, if you're a dev on Solana or working on a project on Solana, then this isn't just a tool like that enables you to like build your own L2 or have separate DA. Like that's one specific kind of vertical, but it's actually even like much more basic things that you want to do on Solana mainnet. And so that kind of ties into like what you're saying. It's like we're trying to expand the Overton window and give more examples of how this can be useful to Solana developers so that we see more and more innovations happening. So I guess to your specific question about like what are other projects. So Switchboard was one of the other early projects that were announced. And oracles are like another classic example. It's like, it depends on your design, right? Pith requires consensus across 5 to 8 publishers that want prices extremely fast. And there's actually been issues, back in March with Pith where like there was no way to differentiate how fast a publisher uploaded their prices, and that ended up like stalling a lot of the margin protocols where they had stale Oracle prices during March when congestion on Solana was bad. And it really impacted DeFi. And like that's a classic like consensus mismatch of like everyone knows what the incentive should be and how you should get paid, but there was no fine-tuned ability to differentiate for that. And so Switchboard, uses a different like mechanism slightly. But I mean, if you think about for them, like whether you're trying to bridge off-chain data onto on-chain data, that's extremely easy with an Oracle framework, right? Especially as like prediction markets pick up, or however, I think they're trying to change up their Oracle design somewhat. And so again, it's like you have multiple people submitting prices and exactly how they implement it. But then I think bridging is a different kind of non-Oracle use case that is also like cross-chain and extremely easy. We have a lot of capital flowing between different chains. It's somewhat easy for people to verify like capital is left an address on chain X and has been delivered to an address on chain Y. But how you do that programmatically, I mean, we know that bridging is extremely hard. And so some sort of kind of validator council to verify that that behavior has happened. We're talking to, some projects about implementing that in a different design than like traditional bridges, and think that's a really interesting use case. And I mean, I guess personally, There's some like kind of SVM style, L2 style things that are happening. There's a lot of like hybrid network extensions on Solana where I think restaking also fits in well. And I guess the last one is DPIN. That DPIN is all about off-chain actions that are positive sum for the economy in a decentralized manner. But the really tricky part about DPIN is how you verify people are actually taking this action, right? And I mean, there's been a lot of kind of drama with some DPIN projects about like, is the physical part of this actually happening? And so I think restaking, and we'll see how this plays out, but is also potentially a really important tool for those projects to the extent that they have other ways to verify behavior is happening, and they can verify it and distribute the rewards via Jito restaking. That could be a major unlock for how soon they're able to actually launch a product with verifiable services delivered by their user base.
I like the switchboard example probably the most, because there's a really clear example in that story of where this insurance policy, the stake that they're getting, could have paid out, the against like the harm in some way of that was done when they had the stale price feeds. That's a good example of where like, yeah, you might have gotten slashed and lost some money for not delivering the quality service that you needed to, but then the users would have been made whole or somewhat whole. And so it brings more trust and security to the entire space, because like these apps, like not everything happens on chain, right? Like you need some other things to make some of these apps work. And so this brings, more security and trust. I'm curious, like Omar, wondering like what the challenges were with Mantis and the restaking you guys have built, and if there's like some things that just pop up for you as far as like what you're seeing with Jito and I don't know, cross-pollination of ideas that we could have here on the call.
No, I mean, we had, the architecture we built was very similar to EigenLayer, essentially, where we have like, one sort of big contract where a bunch of different LSTs flow in, and then you have the way to register new services. In our case, the specific service is Solana ABC, which maybe we can migrate to Jito or supplement it with Jito security, restaking security now as well. And then from there, we had a contract that specifies like slashing parameters, which we needed slashing on launch to enable, because it's a bridge, right? So if there's any like miscalculations of the try or proofs are being posted incorrectly, we need slashing to actually happen. So we had a vault. We also have a vault for slashing as well, where like the slash funds go to, and then like a way of redistributing that amongst the other operators. So I think like the core fundamental tech is, across restaking in general, is like pretty similar. The main sort of differences, I think, across all these different types of protocols, at least from my perspective, is the way they handle covenants on top, which is like, how do you do rewards distributions? How easy is it for you to onboard slashing parameters? How do you have, like, for instance, EigenLayer, there's like LRTs that only specifically are mandated to validate like specific types of AVSs, as they call them in EigenLayer land. How do you reconcile, like, how do you sort of allow an operator to pick and choose the different services? So I think it's all about like preserving as much modularity as possible, while also allowing the teams that want to impose economic security on themselves, having a way to be the most flexible as possible that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that you said, you might append or even like migrate over to Jito restaking. And I just want to point out for people who might be listening that are maybe you're a first time entrepreneur, or you're like new to Solana, but this ecosystem is all about open sourcing and composability. And there's so much to build. And like when Omar started working on this, there was no restaking on Solana and they needed it. And so they had to build it on top of like 10 other really hard things. And so there's just a lot to build and maintain. And so sometimes you might look out in the market and be like, oh, that already exists. But the reality is, for a lot of teams that are building these things from scratch, they wish it had existed before they built it, and they might want it kind of off their plate. So I see lots of opportunities like that. But anyway, Brian, I don't know if you have a response to Omar or any other thoughts. I'd love to hear them.
No, yeah, I mean, I think agree 100%. It's still not the easiest thing to build on Jito restaking, just because the product is so new, and so like the documentation isn't as robust as it should be. The whole project is open source, but it's not, there's not like robust library of open source examples of how you can do different things. But if you fast forward 3 or 6 months, then there's a variety of NCNs, there's a bunch of VRTs, like all of that stuff exists. And so you can kind of just cherry pick from the network. And if you think about from the developer perspective, it just makes life a lot easier, where you don't need to worry about doing things from scratch, and you can just get moving really fast, right? I mean, right now, the scarcest resource by far in crypto is like developer time, because the market is good. Everyone wants to launch a product that works as fast as possible. And this is really a platform, as we see it, to empower developers to get their products out faster.
Love it. Yeah, I love it. And, if we were talking before the show about we're potentially building an NCN. I'm not going to talk about exactly what it will be yet. I want to wait a little while before we announce it, but happy to contribute to those docs and like dig in. I love that it's open source. It's one of my favorite things about Jito is you guys build open source software and kind of live the ethos. So thanks for that contribution. We're getting towards the top of the show, and I kind of ask this at the end of every show we do, but like, what have we not talked about that we should have talked about related to Jito or restaking? What's something that we might not have covered that you want to get across?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered a lot. I think, certainly we haven't like discussed in depth maybe the Jito tip example. So I can like briefly touch on that and like refer people to docs, just because I think it's really cool. I mean, from a high level, Jito tips are doing about $2.5 billion in annualized volume, depending on like when you look back at it, which is a crazy number, right? I mean,
nice.
Jito tips actually exceeded network inflation, I think, like one of the last few days. So it's really a testament to like how much activity is on Solana and how many cool products people built on Solana. But it's a lot of value. And how this all like fits in is that you need to figure out, the vast majority of those are going to like network stakers as well as validators. And so it's all redistributed to make the network layer more robust and decentralized. And you need to like figure out how exactly they're routed to individual stakers, individual validators. There's over 2,000 validators on Solana. There's over, I think, 1 million or 1.5 million stake accounts. And it's like within each slot, which is a lot. And so it's really a system where like a bunch of people with access to Solana data on stakers and validators all just like upload this view on what the amount of tips, 2.5 billion, it's divided per epoch. So that's, call it 20 million per epoch or something. How this 20 million piggy bank that builds up should be split up. And it's just a really easy way for people to supply that information, and then it gets distributed in a completely permissionless way where no one from Jito, no one from anywhere else has to be part of this, but it's all economic incentives to get it done. And then, the way it's secured is you have Jito Sol or other LSTs staked here, and they get a benefit from providing the accurate information. And so there's substantial yield to LST holders for providing the service. And then there's also a JTO staking discussion that's up for governance, where in addition to the security of Jito Sol, you have security from JTO. And so that's something that is, I think the Jito community is really excited about, that now their token has utility in this restaking network. And it's really just a bridge between kind of the Jito tip side of the business that people know well, the Jito Sol side, and like the linkage here is restaking and how that helps decentralize this. And what hopefully is an example just for Solana people of like how this is all possible, and one piece of inspiration for how they may use it in their own project.
Love it. And so, yeah, and that's the benefit to the Jito ecosystem, right? It's more utility for your liquid staking token, more utility for JTO. There's no real revenue like generated from the restaking protocol. Like you don't charge devs on chain for some of their revenue, or is there?
There's a small fee on rewards distributed. And so that's just like incentive alignment of like, network should be paying some amount of money probably for people that are staking to them. And it's a small piece of whatever revenue they're paying out to their stakers to help just fund ongoing improvements and security of that protocol.
Interesting. Yeah, I loved, and just on a different note, the fact that Jito tips got bigger than inflation, like outpaced inflation on mainnet. And there's been a lot of talk. I've seen that bubbling up in crypto Twitter about Solana and the economics of Solana. And it's funny, we have this IBRL, increased bandwidth, reduced latency meme, but like it really is kind of the answer to all of it, right? The more you drive through Solana, the pipes of Solana, and the closer that gets, better experience that is for users, then you're gonna increase that revenue, and the economics will start working even better than they already do. I think. I'm not against like protocol changes, but it just seems to me that's the easiest answer, is to drive more usage. And you guys are certainly contributing to that. And I think these NCNs will, as well as apps, right? Like big, like actual apps with product market fit, are kind of the answer. So with that, thanks for coming on the show. It's been great to have you, and look forward to tracking the progress of Jito restaking and all things Jito. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, no, appreciate you having me on, Alex, and good chatting with you, Omar.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. All right, hit stop. Just hang on for like a couple.